I'm just going to wait a moment because I see the folks still joining, but we'll get started in a few seconds. Yeah, thank you all for attending. This is the Adaptation and Action webinar series. And today we are really lucky to have Meredith Cornett, Sachi Graver, and Erin Mackey to talk about the value of natural climate solutions. Okay, let's get going. People might keep joining, but yeah, thank you again. We have this Adaptation and Action webinar series once every month on the third Tuesday of the month, hosted by the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And I'd also like to highlight, we have some upcoming events. So like I mentioned, we have this webinar, and next month it'll actually be me. It'll be me presenting on some of my PhD research related to adaptive silviculture for climate change. And then after that, we'll be looking at Climate Forward, which is a report about climate change or climate data used by architects and architectural professionals with HGA. And then we'd also like to highlight that we have the Climate Action Handbook launch with Dr. Heidi Roop. She's our director, and that's March 28th at 7 p.m. at the Bell Museum. So we'd love it if you join us for that. And then lastly, we have the Midwest Climate Resilience Conference that's coming up in the fall. That's October 25th to 27th in Duluth. It'll be at the deck looking over the North Shore and the Lake Superior. So we'll have more information coming about that soon. And some final reminders. So the webinar will end at 1 p.m. And because we're currently in a webinar presentation mode, all participants are muted during the presentation, but we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So feel free to pop any questions in that Q&A there. And Nate Meyer, who's here with me today, will help accumulate those and get those answered at the end. And then this webinar will also be recorded and posted on MCAP's YouTube channel at a later date, so you can check it out again later. And as I mentioned, you're muted, so please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. You may type your own question or upvote a question that you would like to see answered. And then we'll end promptly at 1 p.m. So I'm really pleased to introduce our presenters. Meredith Cornett is the Climate Change Director for the Nature Conservancy for Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Sachi Graver is the Associate Director for Climate with the Nature Conservancy in the same region, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And Erin Mackey is the Working Lands Focused Area Leader with Earth Economics. And if you're curious about more climate news, you can check us out there. We'll go over that at the end too. But yeah, thank you all. And I'll stop sharing my screen so you all can share yours and get started with your presentation. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Jamie. We really are excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and move into my sharing mode. And just let me know if things are showing up okay. Great. Okay. Well, again, Sachi and Erin and I are just delighted to be here, and thank you for hosting MCAP. The Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership is such a key organization in our state, and you're just really leading the way on increasing climate resilience through research, collaboration, and communication. So we're just thrilled to be a part of that. And so I'll just be setting the stage today, and then my colleague Sachi will move into providing more detail about our original Natural Climate Solutions report, which came out in 2021. And it was really the inspiration for the work that we'll be sharing today as well. So Erin is going to present some powerful results on the economic value generated by investments in nature. So this is a debut for us. This is our very first presentation on this newly released report. So again, thanks so much for the opportunity. So a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. You can see the local chapter stats here at the bottom of the screen. We are a global environmental organization founded in 1951. So we're also kind of a geriatric organization when you think about it a certain way. But our mission is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work in 70 countries around the world and in all 50 states in the US. Sachi and I work for the only 3-state chapter in the US. So that is a unique feature of our program here. We are working hard along with so many partners on solving the climate crisis. It's our #1 priority along with solving the biodiversity crisis. They go hand in hand. And our commitment is still, even after yesterday's IPCC report, which presented some challenges, we are trying to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change by keeping warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're sort of hanging on by our claws to that one. And we have 2 priority strategies that, if scaled up, can really go a long ways towards helping us meet this goal. We'll be emphasizing natural climate solutions today. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then we'll also be touching on this second one, nature-based adaptation. Sachi will be going into some details there, as well as Aaron. And this is just so much in sync, again, with MCAP's great work to support thriving climate-ready landscapes and communities. So again, it's great to be having this conversation. So what are natural climate solutions anyway? It can sound a little bit jargony, but it's pretty intuitive. Simply put, this is a suite of management, restoration, and conservation actions that are really effective at storing carbon and sequestering carbon. So this is really important because we have a giant problem to solve. We need to cut 30 gigatons per year in carbon emissions by 2030 to keep the climate impacts in check. The great news is that investing in nature, these are the actions we see at the bottom of the figure, so natural and working lands, can get us 1/3 of the way to our destination for global carbon emissions reduction. And this all works because of plants. Photosynthesis is the ultimate carbon capture technology. So we have plants to thank for that. And what's really cool about all of this too is that we know how to do these things already. We can manage farmland better. We can restore forests and wetlands. We just need to scale them up, and that requires bigger investments. But wait, there's more. There is a whole lot more here. Natural climate solutions provide an excellent return on investment. So they're not just for climate mitigation, they're also for all the other co-benefits that they generate. And so you'll hear more about all of this from Sachi and Aaron, but as a bit of foreshadowing, and this is kind of where that adaptation piece comes in, every dollar that we spend on natural climate solutions, as you can see here, generates more than $8 in public benefits. And it's really hard to beat that kind of return. So I'm really pleased to turn things over here to Sachi to share more about natural climate solutions opportunities in Minnesota.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you all again for the chance to be here today. We are really excited to talk about this topic with you and to get your questions and feedback. Like Meredith said, this is the first time we've presented, so all questions welcome. I want to kind of set Aaron up by bringing you through this journey that we went through as the Nature Conservancy thinking about this topic. So Meredith mentioned that we put out a report in 2021 on basically the opportunity here in Minnesota to use natural climate solutions to combat climate change. And what that report shows, the big takeaway is that we have 26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year potential from NCS. And just in case some of you don't speak geek, the MMT, 26 MMT is 26 million metric tons. of carbon dioxide, a common greenhouse gas. So we're equating everything to how much carbon dioxide would it be similar to in the atmosphere in terms of its global warming potential. So what this shows is 26 million metric tons is about as much carbon emissions as 7 coal plants would release. So we're talking about essentially the same impact as having 7 coal plants that are emitting and then sucking those emissions out year after year after year after year. So that's actually a pretty big impact. That's pretty significant in terms of Minnesota's overall emissions and where we're trying to go as a state. And just knowing those numbers isn't enough, really, right? And so one of the big reasons that we wanted to put this report out was to have something to talk about, right? The numbers aren't perfect. There's a note on here that we've updated some of them already because the science is continuing to get updated, and we're continuing to understand more specifically what the opportunity looks like. But what we did was, we've talked to all kinds of stakeholders. We've brought the report to legislators in Minnesota. We've worked with partners. We've testified based on the numbers. And we've seen some real excitement around this. We've seen some massive increases in funding around natural climate solutions. The governor's latest climate framework includes a whole section on natural and working lands. And so we're seeing that by continuing to educate and try to prioritize these projects, we are increasing investments in climate action at the state level. And that's really where we want to be. Next slide, Meredith. So I want to go one step deeper into the details here. So on the right, that bar graph is showing a list of natural climate solutions available in Minnesota. So if you start by just kind of looking at those yellow bars, those are all referring to agriculture practices. So this is explicitly working lands. These are lands that are being managed for economic benefit. And we're thinking about what does it look like to try to kind of maximize climate outputs on that land. And what we see is that actually ag is one of the biggest opportunities in Minnesota. It's the biggest opportunity in Minnesota. If we can get cover crops on the fields so that we're drawing more carbon down out of the air, if we can reduce the amount of fertilizer, nutrients that we're putting onto the soil, that will cut the amount of nitrous oxides that are being released. And those are also a greenhouse gas. So Meredith described natural climate solutions, right, are land protection, land management, and land restoration strategies. But we're thinking both about, in the nitrogen case, not emitting the way that we usually emit. And we're thinking about, in the planting cover crops case, pulling the carbon down out of the air. So it kind of goes both directions. And on the left of the screen, you'll see a kind of a list that's color coded, because I really want to shout out a lot of amazing work that's happening across the state and in the state policy scene. So when we think about agriculture and soil health, the state last year authorized a soil health incentive program that is being funded in the millions or tens of millions of dollars now. And that's really directly providing on the ground cost shares, excuse me, to farmers who are implementing these practices. If we move down to the green bars, those green bars reflect trees. So we're thinking about the forest resources that Minnesota is famous for. And again, we see that there are some options that are more about protection, so avoiding conversion. And there are some options that are more about how are we managing our forests to store as much carbon as we can. And again, actually, like right now, this year in conversation at the Capitol is a discussion of how can we better fund this work? How can we increase funding to get trees on the ground? And how can we get funding to increase the state nursery capacity? Because actually, PNC has started a conversation or is involved in a conversation about what reforesting 1 million acres would look like. And you know what? There aren't enough seedlings. There isn't the capacity to grow that many baby trees right now. And so this capacity issue is really an important one. It's one that the state is looking at investing in. And then really quickly, the orange and the blue bars in this chart are referring to grasslands and wetlands and peatlands respectively. And again, we just really see the state of Minnesota leading here. We have, through the Reinvest in Minnesota program, we have funding going to grassland protection and grassland restoration. And Minnesota is one of the only states that has a Wetland Protection Act that is so robust in place. And this basically means that you can't convert wetlands without restoring an equivalent wetland somewhere else. So you see that the bars for avoided conversion are actually relatively small compared to what they could be. Okay, so what this bar is showing, what this chart is showing is the total amount of opportunity if we were to implement cover crops on every single acre of farmland, and if we were to plant trees in every single part of the state where, you know, there was historically forests, and where it's appropriate to put trees now. And we know that that's a pretty sizable opportunity. And we can go to the next slide, Meredith. Do you want to just skip this one? Sorry, I think I got an old version of the slides up here. But I want to really flag that in terms of that opportunity. So I mentioned the number 26 million metric tons. Here it is again. Again, if we can fund and implement every single natural climate solution to its maximum extent across the state, we can do the same amount of work as taking 7 coal plants offline. And that's without the chemicals, that's without the construction, that's without a lot of the negative benefits that can come with more technological solutions. Next slide. But what we really want to underscore is that we're talking about both adaptation and mitigation. So I've only been talking about mitigation so far, thinking about how do we reduce the overall impact of climate change by reducing greenhouse gases. There's a whole other side of the conversation, which is how do we live with climate change now that we know that it's happening? We're seeing floods in Minnesota, right? We're seeing droughts, we're seeing heat waves. And knowing that these things are going to happen more and more, that's where the adaptation conversation comes in. You already know this, you're here at an MCAP presentation. So this is where I want to pivot us and hand things off to Erin, because in our initial report, we were only looking at tons of carbon. That was it was an easy metric for us to discuss and to quantify. And we didn't have a way at that time to think about some of these bullets on your screen. So we kind of said, right, we know that natural climate solutions can reduce flooding and erosion. We know that having more trees can help absorb some of that water and keep the soil healthy and strong so that it doesn't just wash away during storms. But we don't really know how to quantify that benefit. Similarly, we know that urban green infrastructure can reduce the impact of urban heat islands. We know that green spaces increase neighborhood values, and they can improve quality of life. And so that's where we entered conversation with Erin and asked her team to help us think about, you know, what is the true value of these things and how can we really talk about that in a way that is understandable, you know, knowing that there is this whole vast ecosystem of various services being provided. So I'll turn things over to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Sachi. And yeah, so ecological economics is how we value those co-benefits that Sachi is talking about. So Earth Economics is a nonprofit organization. We're proudly based in Tacoma, Washington for over 20 years, and we are a leader in ecological economics. So what does that mean? Just simply put, you know, we take nature into account. So we are all benefiting from nature every day, often without realizing it or in ways we maybe don't fully recognize. And Earth Economics identifies and quantifies those benefits to ensure they are included in this decision-making process that Sachi was talking about. And we call these benefits ecosystem services. Next slide. So what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are the benefits humans receive from nature, which are essential to our survival and can be assigned a dollar value. So think like breathable air, drinkable water, nourishing food, and disaster mitigation are all prime examples of ecosystem services. Their benefits are similar to other economic benefits typically valued in the economy, so like skilled workers, buildings, and infrastructure. When ecosystem services are lost, we can measure the economic impact in terms of job loss, infrastructure costs, restoration costs, or property losses. Next slide. These ecosystem services can be considered public benefits because where benefits accrue can be dispersed among residents, businesses, and governments. So, for example, water quality improvements can save governments and businesses money and water purification costs, whereas restored habitat could benefit hunters and anglers. So, as Meredith showed you this image earlier, we found that natural climate solutions would provide benefits valued at 8 times how much it would cost to implement them. And this could even be an even greater value because the benefits that we valued are limited by the available literature. So these are a conservative estimate of the value. So the reason this is because natural climate solutions could provide and protect just under $37 billion worth of ecosystem services in Minnesota every year. Here's just a few of those services and their values. Some worth highlighting, I personally think, include nearly $4 billion worth in water quality and supply, as well as $291 million in flood damage reduction every year. Next slide. Oh, you already got it. These benefits can be summed up by land cover types that are either restored or protected from incompatible development, which for this project focused on forests, grasslands, and wetlands and peatlands. Avoided conversion of natural lands would protect over $4 billion in benefits, whereas restoring natural lands would provide nearly $33 billion. So I just want to point out that these results should not be interpreted as forests providing the most value and benefits. There was just simply more ecosystem services with values for forests than other land cover types that could be included in this study. So think of grasslands and wetlands and peatlands all being more undervalued here. Next slide. Thanks. So although our evaluation is done spatially, we were also able to estimate how much benefits could accrue for different demographics based on where they're located. So for example, environmental justice areas where majority of the people identify as people of color and are experiencing poverty would accrue $425 million in benefits in these communities. We also looked at benefits on croplands, the practices that Sachi was describing earlier. If farmer used those soil health focused practices, those would result in $270 million per year going into farmers' pockets. Natural climate solutions can provide more than just ecosystem services. Their implementation investments would also have a ripple effect to support Minnesota's economy. And that includes providing over 5,000 total jobs every year, leading to more than $140 million in workers' hands. So just to get into a little bit of our methods, and feel free to ask questions later. To put dollar values to these benefits, we use an accepted methodology called the benefit transfer method, where we transfer values to our area of interest from the literature. So think of it like a house appraisal, where the value of a specific home can be estimated through values assigned to other homes with similar characteristics, conditions, and market factors. So remember how I mentioned earlier that you can't really compare the forest value to wetlands and grasslands? This table, I think, really helps explain why. Not every service that exists in an ecosystem has a value in the literature that has been studied already that we could use that would apply to Minnesota. So we wouldn't take a value from Louisiana for flood from hurricanes and apply that in Minnesota. So that's one of the limitations. So consider this definitely an undervaluation of all the co-benefits that would likely come from this investment. Oh, one more. Yeah. So also for how we do the economic contribution analysis, to get our results, basically like jobs, wages, supported by natural climate solutions, we built economic contribution models using InPlan to estimate the ripple effect of investments. So InPlan models basically demonstrate how much in economic activity is supported by every dollar invested in natural climate solutions. This includes the effects from money flowing through supply chain, as well as through employees spending their wages. InPlan allowed us to estimate how NCS investments would support jobs, wages, GDP, and overall economic activity system-wide, as well as taxes at the state and federal level. So I'd just like to quickly thank our research team that worked on this project: Laura Villegas, our PhD economist, Alice Lynn, our GIS manager, and Will Golding, our former research analyst. We put a lot of work into this for TNC, and it really was a pleasure to partner with them on such an impactful project. We know this is a lot to take in, especially if you even glance through the report. There's a lot there for you. This is a very high-level presentation, so please click the link to download the report where we have more information. But I'd love to pass it over to our host and open it up for questions from the audience.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me? Cool beans. All right. Well, I think I am on for the Q&A, and we had quite a few. I will just say to everybody at the outset that there are some questions that are being answered kindly enough through tapped out answers while our presenters have been going. So I encourage you all, if you want to go check out the answered questions as well. But I'll dive in with questions that really seem to sort of target a couple of areas at this point. I'll start first with a few questions just to further explain some of the ideas that you shared. And then there were a lot of questions around how we actually scale this out on the landscape that I think are the really juicy, cool ones that we'll want to dive into. But before we go, there were a couple of questions asking for a little bit more of an explanation of the 26 million metric tons of CO2 each year, and wondering, is that avoided emissions or sequestered emissions, and how does it relate again to coal plants?
Yeah, I can tackle this one. Thank you for asking for the clarification, because there's some kind of mental gymnastics that I think we sometimes take to try to create those equivalencies. The way that we tend to think about carbon benefits from climate action is to first think about the baseline. So how many emissions is the state of Minnesota producing today? And what do we expect to happen in the future? So that's kind of the baseline that we would think about under business as usual. And that includes, for example, a certain rate of land conversion. When you dig up a prairie, prairies have great plant diversity. They have huge root systems and pretty complicated soil structures. And when you dig that all up, you lose a lot of that carbon. So we're thinking about a baseline that includes some emissions already from conversion, from fertilizer use, from transportation, from energy, from everything. And what we're thinking about is how much change from that baseline can natural climate solutions provide. So in the case of land protection actions, so saying you can't convert those grasslands, actually they have to stay as grass, that would be avoiding emissions. And so we have a certain piece of that NCS benefit that is about avoiding emissions. And then on top of that, we can add active sequestration, which is basically anything thing that photosynthesizes. So planting trees, making forests healthier, planting cover crops, planting grasslands, right? We're drawing CO2 out of the air. And the 26 is the sum of those two benefits. So the sum of emissions avoided plus what is sequestered. And we talk about those in 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, because if you think about a forest, there's a 20 to 100 year period where any change in the management is going to lead to year on year benefits. So we're talking about, how much can we really see in the next 50 years, kind of as an average is what we're talking about, how much benefit we would get. And the coal plants are just an artificial attempt to help you, to help us understand what 26 million metric tons is, because I have no idea. And so the equivalence there is just kind of a tool. But if you think about a coal plant with a smokestack and all of the emissions that are pouring out of that for a whole year, times 7, that's about the amount of carbon that we could avoid or sequester. So that we usually just say we could mitigate. That's about the amount of carbon we could mitigate through NCS.
There's a great tool out there called the EPA, it's Environmental Protection Agency's Carbon Equivalency Calculator. And so if you want to play with your own examples out there, I think that that's a great resource.
Perfect. Thank you. So the second question, I think, looks more at the economic returns, Aaron, and there were a couple of questions that I'll sort of piece together. One of our participants just asked for more specific examples of how the benefit dollars are determined, but then someone else really asked specifically about elaborating on job creation, like what kinds of jobs are going to be created.
Sure. So I'll start with the job one real quick, just because it's a straightforward answer for how AmPlan does their modeling. So this is including all full-time and part-time jobs. So the way that they do their calculation is not full-time equivalents, like not based on hours worked. So you could have variability in how many actual jobs in reality would be created. Because these could be, if you have one person at a company that is working really 2 jobs, those will be modeled as basically 2 jobs in AmPlan. So those nuances are not going to be included in there. Also, if you have somebody that works that does a seasonal job that is only 6 months out of the year, that would be a 0.5. So these are job years, but not full-time equivalency, so not based on how many hours are worked. So just wanted to clarify that. And then also for what industries, we did not actually dig into which industries because it was quite a large project, so we did not have the time to dig into that exactly. So yeah, so to answer your question, hopefully that helps, but I'm sorry that I don't have the answer for where exactly those jobs would accrue. Most likely would be more in the implementation side. There was pretty significant direct effects of these. So we would assume people that do kind of the technical field work side of things and the planning side for the projects, but can't say for sure.
And Aaron, can you give an example or two of how that translational benefit valuation is made?
Yeah, absolutely. Second question, right? I did see that one pop up. So specific examples. So for example, with how we do that benefit transfer method is how these benefits are valued. So the way that works is there was, for disaster mitigation, there was a study that found basically this many dollars in property damage was avoided because of forests that were storing water and helping to prevent that flooding. And essentially that study took place in a similar area as where we were looking in Minnesota. And so we basically take that value, we reduce it to $1 per acre value. we used a pretty big GIS analysis to kind of get these practices mapped out, and then get that acreage for forests and apply that dollar per acre from the literature to that forest to say, okay, that we estimate if we, protect these forests from development, then they are continuing to provide this much in ecosystem services. If we restore this many acres of forest, we multiply that acreage then by our value to get, we're going to be adding this much money in disaster mitigation for forests. I hope that helps kind of explain further.
Perfect. And then the last sort of explanation-based question I have in the mix right now is, someone said it's interesting that ecological services did not include public health, physical and mental. Seems like that's a very, measurable benefit. I suspect you had to draw some boundaries. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how were those boundaries drawn? What might be a co-benefit, or what might be the potential for co-benefits that aren't in this report?
Absolutely. And public health is actually a service that we have valued in other projects in the past. We just did not have a value that was going to be applicable for this particular project. But absolutely, there's plenty from that table that I brought up. There's plenty of services that are provided by these that we weren't able to value that absolutely provide significant value. And whether that can be quantifiable in terms of dollars or not, we've also, like, sometimes people are less prone to wanting to put a dollar value on, say, things like mental health and all, but also with cultural significance as well. Sometimes it's not always appropriate to put a dollar value to those things. But public health, when it comes to like our physical health and like hospital costs, absolutely. There are studies that I've looked at other areas and ones that we've included in other projects that just didn't apply to this one, unfortunately. So it was a literature availability issue.
Thank you. So why don't we move into some of the questions that surround how to scale this on the landscape. I want to start first with a few questions focused on working with different audiences to make this happen. One question is how to reach active farmers. What groups are influential, or are you working with and educating and helping them be a part of scaling natural climate solutions?
Meredith, do you want me to start? Do you want to take this one? Okay. So I think this is a really good question. And one of the things that we hear about a lot in the climate space, right, is so you have these climate activists in an urban space who are yelling about climate change and, have these very progressive ideas. And then you have the folks who are actually doing the work who may or may not be on the same page. And I think agriculture is just a great example of this, where, as we know, most farmers in Minnesota are really focused on feeding their families, right? Like, they're not spending a whole lot of time in general thinking about what their role is in climate mitigation. So I can think of a couple really great programs that I'd like to share, but I think there is a continued need to kind of think about this. How do we reach those audiences, and what are the right channels to do that? One program I want to mention is pretty innovative. And so this is like a new approach to trying to solve the problem, right? The Nature Conservancy is involved in a program called the Ecosystem Services Marketplace Consortium. And this is a group, it's a collaboration of partners who are looking at ecosystem services payments. So Erin kind of described ecosystem services for us, but thinking about, right, how do we quantify carbon storage? How do we quantify water purification? Where are there markets available to pay for these kinds of benefits? So carbon markets exist, right? Where are there markets available? How can we kind of quantify what's happening on a per farm basis, and then get those payments to kind of follow the value chain back to the farm so that farmers themselves are incentivized to increase the amount of carbon stored on their land or improve the way that water is filtered on their land. That's one that's very market-based. Another market-based incentive program is what I mentioned around the state's soil health program. So that's literally the state offering a payment and saying, you know, we think that reducing tillage is in the benefit of the state, and we will compensate you if you will implement this practice on your land. So again, very market-driven. There are certainly softer approaches. Our team works a lot through, you know, soil and water conservation districts. Did I get that acronym right? Or, you know, other forms of kind of local advisors to try to have trusted communicators delivering the message. But I don't think we've solved that yet. Meredith or Erin, do you want to add anything?
So one thing that I will add here is that we've got a couple of great stories actually on our Trees, Water, Soil page. And I can share the link there in just a moment, but we have 4 different case studies with farmers working in conjunction with soil health practices and talking about some of the ways that it has increased productivity, increased yield. And we're starting to get some traction with our outreach through our chapters, agriculture initiative, as well as our North America Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, to really engage with farmers more in Minnesota and around the US. I will save that, or I'll post that link here with Jamie's help. And Erin is an actual agriculture person, so I'm sure you have something to say about this.
So for the scaling specifically, so that's one thing too that is always kind of for agriculture side specifically, it's always a farm by farm decision of whether or not that these practices are suitable for them, because there may be prairie areas that in the Midwest and everything that have basically, prairies were naturally, before humans were involved, naturally tilled by the animals that roamed, right? So there is a little bit of natural tillage that may be suitable in some areas, but that aren't necessarily beneficial for the farming climate in other areas. So that's one thing too. It's a farm by farm basis for whether or not these will be beneficial for both the farmer and the climate. And that's where, there's also those options for reduced till. It's not always just going to no till. And that's kind of, I think, why really the reasoning why people say no till / reduced till, because a little bit can still be beneficial. And as well as like cover cropping, that depends on your cropping system. So when it comes to scaling this, it's really about kind of making sure that the farmers who would be interested in this, whose farms it would be suitable for, have the technical assistance and resources to do so. And that's what extension offices are so wonderful for. So go extension. That really, I went to land-grant universities and worked with extension research facilities. That's a really great resource. And yeah, oftentimes those, they will also put on a lot of talks and everything and try to get in touch with farmers. So if farmers that have heard only a little bit about this and are interested in it, direct them to their local extension agents. The ones that I knew that I worked with, not necessarily in Minnesota, but they worked around the clock. I heard them calling people back at like 7 p.m. because they were out in the field till 6. They are often going to get back in touch with you.
Awesome. Thank you for I was going to gently slide extension into the mix.
Always.
So there was another question that actually looks a bit in the opposite direction. What are solutions that individual households or more urban locations can participate. Someone just posted in the Q&A that their understanding is that heat could be a big human health threat related to climate change in urban areas, thus co-benefits to having more trees and plants in cities, including on rooftops. So what can those of us who are not living in more rural areas and farms do to help?
Okay, I can take just one of them, and that we did for climate stability include reducing heat-related health impacts is actually one of the values that is included in our climate stability value that we did for forests specifically, and that's for our urban forests. So that was applied specifically where we identified forest restoration areas that were in urban areas. So just wanted to say that was included, but I can let Sachi take it from there.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I think the question of what individuals can do is such an important one. And it's like shocking to me that we are this far into climate science and recognizing climate change. And I think many of us still feel super overwhelmed by the amount of things that there are out there. And like, how do I prioritize? And what do I do? And what if my mom is sick and I need to get on a plane? So I would say I kind of think about this as 3 categories of things you can do. So the first thing you can do is talk about it, right? You can talk with your friends and family about climate change and climate solutions, and you can try to get the conversation going so that public awareness grows and we start to see more public solutions. I mean, that could be anything from, on the not nature focused, like talking about transit and opportunities for using it more, or the need to grow transit options. Or it could be something like, gosh, I wish I could have a pollinator garden in my house, but I'm not sure how to start. Do you know? I think talking about it is really low-hanging fruit and is something that all of us can do that is needed to continue to normalize climate action as something that we really, that last IPCC report, right, I think said we basically need to invest 5 times more like now. So I think the more we talk about it, the more it's kind of in the conversation. That's number 1. Number 2, I think, is taking the steps that make sense for you. So we all have different circumstances. We all, live in different places with different resource availability, and you're never going to be a perfect climate human. Like, you're just not, because there are systems that are going to work against you. But can you plant trees? Can you plant a pollinator garden? Can you grow some of your own food so that it's not getting shipped on a truck from California? I think some of those little things are really important. And in the same way that having a conversation can inspire other folks, maybe your neighbor sees your super cool pollinators that happen to be native prairie species and they put one in too. And then I think the third option, so talk about it, do what you can, and then think about scaling is probably what I would say. And that's where we shared the link to our advocacy page in the chat. But a lot of this is structural, right? Like, it's pretty hard to buy an EV and have lower emissions transportation if you can't afford an EV and there are no EV chargers in your neighborhood. That's not on you. It's pretty hard to talk about pollinator boulevards if you're not allowed to plant pollinator things on the boulevard in some cities, or if you're not allowed to plant trees on the boulevard, or if you're not allowed to plant trees in your yard because you live in a rental property and your landlord isn't into it. Some of these things are actually structural, they're systemic. And so thinking about what you can do to just put one more finger on the scale, I think is pretty important. And that's the one for me that can sometimes feel overwhelming, because it's like, what is my one voice gonna do? But we all know that once you have enough voices, you actually start to see some change. So I don't know, that's the way I think about it. I don't know if that helps.
I also just want to put in a plug for Dr. Heidi Roop's upcoming book.
Today, it released today. It's
I
out.
just got the notice that my copy had shipped. So yeah, the Climate Action Handbook, very exciting, more solutions for all of us. And, you know, as you think about planting a tree, potentially where you live, or maybe in your yard, there's a great resource at the DNR about where you plant that tree in relation to where your house is can make a big difference to your heating and cooling bills. And in addition, the tree canopy of the city as a whole. So Jamie, a few comments back, dropped growing shade link in the chat as well. So this is a new tool, Met Council, Tree Trust, and the Nature Conservancy that can really help to identify areas of the city that can benefit from more tree cover. This is just the Twin Cities metro area, but potential to apply it other places too. But
Perfect.
energy conservation through trees, tree care is how you would find the tree and home energy relationship.
So we have just time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'm going to pivot and turn to a couple of questions, I think, Sachi, that build on the last comment you made. And that is, how many of the 20 plus million metric tons are actually achievable at different implementation costs? What can we really be capable of doing? And related to that, then, what other policies or incentive structures should we be working toward to make even more of these achievable? And then the last follow-up question, I'm just going to ask all three now, is so what can me and the 84 other people still on the presentation do to make those more of a possibility?
It's such a timely question. And again, I'll take a first stab here and then invite Meredith and Aaron to jump in where I miss things. To the first point, I think that's probably a pretty nuanced answer about how many of those 26 million metric tons can actually be achieved. What I would say is based on the science that we currently have, based on our current understanding, all of them can be achieved. And the question really comes down to, what are we willing to pay for it? And what are we willing to sacrifice for it? In my personal opinion, if you look at Aaron's research and you say, on average, every dollar you spend on these activities is going to return $8.50 to the state, it seems kind of like a no-brainer that trying to optimize these solutions, also knowing that they're contributing to the state's climate action framework and the state's goals and the state's carbon neutrality goals, like knowing all of the ways that these things intersect, it seems like we should be shooting for 100%. And I'm going to caveat that science is not perfect. Like, this was honestly, just being very truthful, this was a first cut trying to get some numbers out there so we can start having the conversation and developing things further. So certainly, I saw some comments in the chat about cover crops and Minnesota being cold. Yep. I know I've heard cover crops like probably don't really work super well up in sugar beet country because the season is just too short. And there are some ways to get around that. So, you know, in central and southern Minnesota, you can interplant multiple crops often. So you can plant the cover crop before you've harvested the corn, or you can plant the corn before you've harvested the cover crop. And so there are ways to kind of extend the margins of the season. So that's a first non-answer. The second question was, how do we solve these through policy? Okay, so And then how can we influence that policy? Yes, this is the perfect time. We are in the middle of legislative session here in Minnesota, as probably most of you know. And that means we've passed the first legislative deadline. So the bills that are going to be introduced in Minnesota are on the table. And between now and May, what our representatives and our senators are going to be doing is deciding which of those bills are going to make it through and how many dollars they're going to put behind them. I both don't want to get into any type of partisan conversation, and I do want to say that usually climate funding is more supported by Democrats. And this year, the governor is a Democrat, and the House is majority Democrat, and the Senate is majority Democrat. And so in general, the odds are better for passing climate-related funding than they have been. So what bills are we talking about? What are the options? I think there are two kind of big conversations that need to be had, maybe three. And all of these you'll get more information about if you sign up for the advocacy link from the Nature Conservancy. But first, we want to keep the bills on the table that are doing really good things. And I think some of these are pretty standard and some of them are more innovative. So I talked about funding soil health incentives. We talked about funding Reinvest in Minnesota, RIM, to do more land protection and restoration. There are oodles of other programs out there. There's a really great one that one of our colleagues has been working on around water storage. And that's really thinking about how do we keep water on the landscape in rural areas where droughts are just taking out entire crops when they happen and when they're extreme. So one question is like, how can we manage the land so that there's more water retained and we won't have that adverse impact? That's not really a financial incentive, but it's something that certainly can help us when we think about adaptation. So I think there's a whole range of things from climate education to funding for incentivizing climate solutions to state-backed solutions, the state managing their lands in a way that makes sense given climate change. And then we can think about the whole thing all over again for adaptation. So what can the state lead on? How can we resource communities? I know the conversation is still happening around stormwater grants to help communities do the adaptation work they need. And specifically stormwater is thinking right about big floods creating too much water for the pipes and that leading to floods that impact people's houses. And again, like my take here is that if you can make one call or write one note to your legislators this year between now and May and say, I think, pick your favorite three. I think tree planting is important. I think cover crops are important. And I think wetland restoration is important. I think that actually has pretty big returns.
Perfect. In the interest of time, I'll turn it back over to you, Jamie, to close us up, but I'll just summarize by agreeing, Sachi, that action is what matters, right? I mean, the bottom line is take action. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you all so much. That was such a wonderful presentation. I'm super excited to dig into the report myself. I've been kind of nerding out over here. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentations and for being here today. And also thank you to the audience for being so interactive. That's awesome, all the questions we had, and we love to see that. So I'm just going to wrap up here in the last moment and share again, if you're curious about Minnesota climate news, you can follow this QR code and check out some updates from us, or go to www.climate.umn.edu. Another thing that you all might be interested in is we're working to put together this Community Climate Leaders program through MCAP. And so you can follow the QR code there or the Z link at the bottom. And we'd love to hear your input on ways we could, on developing this program, things that you'd be interested in, what you would like in a program like this. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And then Nate shared in the chat, but after the webinar, you'll receive an email that leads to a short evaluation, and we would love to get your feedback on that as well for helping us improve and continue to develop these webinar series. And so I'd like to close again by just saying thank you so much to our panelists, and we had a wonderful time hosting you, and yeah, thank you again, and thank you to the audience.